The final tumbler turned. Behind the wall, the unmistakable sound of a reel-to-reel cassette player starting. "I told you!" Montague half screamed. "I tried to warn you of the horrors that await behind these walls." PseudoPod, episode 699. April 17th, 2020. This week's story, Flash on the Borderlands 51, or LI if you're listening from the Roman Empire. Quaint and Curious Forgotten Lore. Hello everyone, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. I am, as ever, Alistair, your host, and in preparation for episode 700, it gives us tremendous joy to present Quaint and Curious Forgotten Lore, a collection of 3 excellent Flash stories which have certain individuals in common. We begin with A Dark Bird by Bradley H. Sinor. Bradley has been writing for 5/6 of his life and has written many short stories, most of them published in a variety of anthologies and 3 short story collections. His Holmesian collection, The Game's Afoot, a Sherlock Holmes miscellany, is published by Pro Se Productions and is available on Amazon. His new novel, The Eye of Dawn, is forthcoming from Airship 27 Productions. This story is narrated for you by Matt Franklin, a narrative developer and vocal talent working in the game industry, and as will soon become apparent, this is ground which we have visited before, but not in this company, and never from this perspective. And from here, one thing becomes apparent. All these stories, I promise you, as to others, are true.
A Dark Bird by Bradley H. Sinor, narrated by Matt Franklin. She closed the book, placed it on the table, and finally decided to walk through the door. The words of the poems echoed in her head. She hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold, as the blue flames wrapped around her, sending a tingling cold into the deepest bits of her. For the longest time there was nothing. Finally, in the distance came the sound of water gently lapping against the piers of a dock, the cold December winds reaching out onto the water. A dark bird of her desire circled near her.
"The one you seek is near,"
said the creature. 2 men in the heavy jackets and caps of seamen shivered as she passed, one crossing himself and drawing deeper within his jacket. The other crossed himself, glancing up into the sky at the full moon. "Why do you torment me?" she asked the bird. The creature landed atop a broken hitching rail. The top bore a slight resemblance to a man's head. It preened the ink-dark feathers, then looked at her.
"You are the one who torments yourself, pulling yourself here beyond the barriers of time and space and desire. You found his words, his dreams, and you want him. You want him as a part of yourself, but you can't have him. You know that as well as I," said the bird. In the distance a bell was tolling, marking the hour. The house she found herself standing in front of was small, 2 stories. She saw the small plate near the door, 203 Amity Street. The dark bird circled and landed on her shoulder. It took her a long time before she could make herself reach up and rap on the door. 3 soft sounds, and then nothing. For what seemed like hours, she stood silently, watching the door, the sounds of the city distant even here. When no answer to her knock came, she found herself walking into the house without invitation. The dark bird on her shoulder murmured sounds into her ear as she moved into the room and saw him. He sat slumped in a worn leather chair, a pile of ancient volumes spread at his feet. "Are you here, or do I dream again?" he asked without looking toward her. "I am here," she replied. "As for dreaming, who can say if this is your dream, mine, or perhaps someone else's?" "Yet each time you come, you take a bit of my soul with you when you leave," he said. The dark bird made the leap from her shoulder to the arm of his chair, then flitted over to a bust that stood in the corner of the room. "Why do you torment me, Lenore? You know I have loved you, but you are always beyond my reach." "And you beyond mine," she said, leaning forward to let her lips brush his cheek.
Goodbye, Edgar." Then, before he could speak, she turned and went back through the door. Outside the house, a man in a long cape, white scarf, and dark hat with 3 roses and a bottle of cognac in his hand stood. "Lenore," he said, and offered her his arm. A moment later, blue flames wrapped around them as the two walked on. The man in the house remained unmoving in his chair as the distant church bell tolled midnight. He finally bestirred himself, taking a sheet of paper, a pen in his hand, and began to write, speaking each word as his pen moved. "Once upon a midnight dreary."
I spend a lot of time thinking about fiction, culture, in fact, as a landscape. It's a useful metaphor and very much my version of the medium is not the message. Because the medium isn't the message, but it is the landscape. And the landscape changes all the time, so frequent compass bearings are a very good plan. Steer towards what you like. Steer towards what interests you. Steer away from what you know damages you. But there are moments of constancy, landmarks even on this protean mercurial landscape. The ravens, the shape defined by its absence, they're always here. Except when the crows tag in for them, of course. Hugin and Munin, Matthew from the Sandman, Eric Draven's rage and love and grief given feathers and a purpose. And of course, Edgar's raven. Or is Edgar the raven's human? Or, as so elegantly posited here, is the creation of this story a fantastically well-turned and elaborately designed, and no doubt lace-cuffed, Mobius loop? The imagination leading our protagonist to haunt Poe's dreams, and in turn inspire him to write what leads the protagonist to haunt Poe's dreams. The raven presented here not as witness, but as messenger, almost as tour guide, ensuring the loop is closed, the circuits joined, and a tormented genius delivers one of his best works. Or perhaps builds the memorial that will dominate the landscape around him for centuries to come. Next up, we have Dr. Lambshead's Dark Room by Selina Chambers. The story was originally published in the Thackeray T. Lambshead Cabinet of Curiosities back in 2011. Selina's fiction and non-fiction have appeared in a variety of venues, including Clarksworld, The Non-Binary Review, Tor.com, Literary Hub, and Luna Luna magazine. Her work has been nominated for Pushcart, Best of the Net, the Hugo, 2 World Fantasy Awards, as well as a Colorado Book Award for Mechanical Animals, which she co-edited with Jason Heller for Hex Publishing. Dr. Lambshead's Dark Room can be found in her debut short story collection, Calls for Submission, from Pelicanesis. And to learn more about Selina, please follow the links in our show notes. Your reader for this story is Tatiana Gray. Tatiana is based in New York City and is an actress of stage, screen, and of course the audio booth. Equally at home, speaking heightened language in a corset, in a leather jacket, spouting obscenities, or anything in between, this depth and facility with multiple genres has garnered her a New York Innovative Theatre Award Best Featured Actress nomination for her work in The Night of Nosferatu. And she, and Selina, and Marty, and Sean, and Alex, and Karen, and myself all have a story for you, and we promise you, it's true.
Dr. Lambshead's Dark Room by Selina Chambers. Narrated by Tatiana Gray. About 10 years ago, Dr. Lambshead published an article in the Psychomesmeric Quarterly about hypnotic techniques inherited from his grandfather, a great confidant of Herr Mesmer. Among Lambshead's mesmeric family legacy was the Valdemar method that enabled the doctor, so he claimed, to extract from even the most cavernous subconscious those diseases that afflicted the soul as demonstrated in the mesmeric stories of Edgar Allan Poe. As a Poe scholar, the doctor's claims intrigued me, and I wrote him requesting a demonstration. I knew the good doctor could not resist a challenge, so to further intrigue him, I mentioned that I felt riddled with a disease of influence that was affecting my work and love life, and offered myself up as the proverbial guinea pig. Within a fortnight, I received an invitation to his house. "The only place," he wrote, "where the Valdemar method could be manifested." Surprisingly, Dr. Lambshead appeared to have no maid or butler, and was already waiting at the door when I arrived. An ancient but spry man in a tailored silk bathrobe, he was headed down the hallway before I could put my bags down and greet him. "To the matter at hand," he said. "Don't tell me a thing. That is for the dark room to show." He waved me inside and led me to the back of the house, where he pulled aside a faded Turkish rug to reveal a trap door that fell open into a dark and dusty staircase. He descended into that darkness, and I followed him, down several flights, feeling my way around the rocky walls, until he suddenly halted and clapped his hands repeatedly. When he stopped clapping, several floating orbs illuminated the basement. "Will o' the wisps," Lambshead said, "from the Iberian coast. I caught them with one of Nabokov's butterfly nets." I looked at the floating lights which graduated from green to purple, blue to red, like childhood's LED sparklers. I held out my hand, and one alighted on my finger, its touch cool as the Mediterranean. How do they float? Live? Glow? He shrugged. Curious, no? This response disappointed me. It was unlike a man of science to pass up a chance to explain away the world. He smiled. "Even in this century, there are still wonders beyond explanation. They are rare, but they do exist. And it has been my hobby, I suppose you could say, to collect all the world's true curios, as you will see. But no more words for now, unless prompted. It disrupts the process." We continued through the hallway, and the will-o'-the-wisps grew brighter as we walked through the cabinet until we entered a dark chamber, empty, but with the exception of 2 worn Louis XVI chairs. "Ah, now we can really begin." He sat in one chair and gestured for me to occupy the other. The will-o'-the-wisps floated out of our hands and hovered between our eyes. They undulated, glowing and dimming in tune with my heartbeat that swooshed through my ears. "I want you to watch the wisps," he whispered, "and tell me, have you experienced these following symptoms? Soaring soul, existential exigency, speaking in cryptically symbolic metaphor, vertigo caused by sublimity, vision heightened by chiaroscuro, dead-dwelling or head-swelling?" "Yes," I said. "To all?" "Yes." His disbelieving expression ebbed into a dare to hope. The 2 will-o'-the-wisps glowed blindingly blue, and I became dizzy and hot, and the doctor and the wisps became double exposed. And somehow I was split in twain by the sides, until there were 2 of me. One sat in front of Lambshead and the undulating wisps, while the other, conscious and seeing, was free to traverse the room. "Do you suffer from daydreaming reflex with reveries that include blackbirds, sense of an unseen censor, or aberrant alliterative applications?" Beady eyes glowed from the wisps, and wings fluttered by my ears. I smelled dried flowers and cut grass, upturned earth, in the fading waft of fabric softener. I looked at my sitting self in the chair and heard her indolent. "Yes." "What else do you see?" The wisps left Lamb's head and my sitting self to illuminate the corners of the empty room, where ebon bookcases grew from the walls, and within them appeared objects that my sitting self described. Jaundiced blueprints of a non-Euclidean pendulum, a stuffed cat with a hissing throat encircled in white fur, a fractured skull chilling a broken bottle of blood-thick sherry, a tailor's mannequin wearing a white, blood-soaked and dirt-streaked dressing gown, its neck a splintered pine plank engraved with claw marks. Beside the cases stood a stuffed gorilla. I couldn't help but touch its fur, which turned to feathers and fluttered to the ground, revealing the tarred and malformed skeleton of a dwarf. Through its eye socket, a gold beetle climbed out and over to a shelf that held a jar of putrescence, and nestled itself in an open locket containing a strand of blonde hair, speckled black. At the very bottom of the bookshelves were several jorums filled with animated landscapes. Tiny ships thrust between a maelstrom pint. A literal leader with a weeping willow tree overlooking a craggy shore, and a court of electrified clouds in the shape of women hovering over an abandoned manse, crying dust and leaves. "What are these?" I asked Lamb's head. From his chair, he looked up to the ceiling, unsure of my voice's source. "What do they look like?" he asked my sitting self. I heard her describe the jorums, and he smiled. "Mood." He spoke into the ether. "They are jars of mood." I squatted at the bookshelf and selected one containing the cosmos. Several minute stars swam like strawberry seeds within a phosphorescent jam. They churned and congealed into the sun, heating the glass. It burned my hand, and I dropped it. With a loud bang, it exploded on the floor, incinerating all within the jar and melting the glass, which pooled and cooled into a Bristol blue fetus. Before I could retrieve it, I heard Lamb's head command me awake, and suddenly I was back in the chair, whole, and subject to his sherry-sweet breath. The bookshelves, the taxidermy, curios, and jars were all gone, but on the ground remained the glass fetus, which the doctor rushed to rescue. He coddled it in his palm. This is what ails you." "A child?" "Of the imagination, yes. You thought you had a disease of influence, but it is much, much worse. You have a disease of the imagination, probably from too much Poe. But don't worry, this here is your cure." "I thought you said it was what ails me." "You are cured," he said, ignoring me. "And I have another child for my cabinet." He waved the wisps away, and they dimmed in rejection. Before I could ask what the other children were, he rushed me from the basement and out of his house. I did not see where he kept the dark room's offspring, and I suppose now I never will. But after I left Lamb's head in his curious cabinet, I admit I felt a lot lighter. Before booting me off the steps, he gave me permission to write of my disease, which seemed to ameliorate my condition more. Having been able to resume a normal life, I am forever indebted to that cabinet and to Dr. Lambshead. When I read of his death just 3 years later, I mourned not only the loss of that great man, but also of his dark room and its soulware nursery that has inevitably become overexposed and returned to the ether.
Here's what Selina had to say. I started my publishing career writing about Edgar Allan Poe, who has been a formative influence on my work since I was a child. I wrote an article in which I coined the term popathy to describe the uncanny and infectious influence he seems to have not only on US letters, but throughout the world. In writing it, I realized that in diagnosing others, I was diagnosing myself, and so Dr. Lambshead's Dark Room became the satirical therapy notes for my own popathy. There is so much to unpack here, not the least of which is the delicious idea of alliteration as a medical symptom. But what I love most of all is the way Selina has managed to bake the horror of the piece not just into what Lambshead keeps in the Dark Room, but in the way everyone feels about it. This is horror as scientific curiosity, horror as a treatable condition, and in that curious way, what becomes horrific is the sense of fangs being pulled, iron collars locked on, horror not understood and implicitly accepted, but horror tamed and quantified by a doctor simultaneously too respectful and too apathetic to look into the reasons why it exists at all. The return of the nursery to the ether at the end, then, takes on two very different tones, and you really can pick which one you would like. The first is an oddly hopeful one. The dinosaurs released as the Jurassic Park theme plays. The second is far darker. The moment where the enclosures open, and the beasts are returned to the wild. Or, for those of you who have seen Cabin in the Woods, the sound of every elevator at once arriving on the ground floor. And that brings us to our final story. Or in this case, poem. The Conqueror Worm by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar really needs no introduction, and he's getting one next week anyway. Your reader for this story is Wayne Johnson, and he deserves one for sure. Wayne was born and raised in New Jersey. He worked as a clinical scientist in the pharmaceutical industry for 40 plus years. He currently lives in South Central Kentucky, the land of bourbon, Corvettes, and corrupt politicians. So, get ready, because one last time this week, Edgar, Wayne, Marty, Sean, Karen, Alex, and myself have a story for you. And we promise you, it's true.
Poem from Ligeia by Edgar Allan Poe. Lo, 'tis a gala night within the lonesome latter years. An angel throng, bewinged, bedight in veils and drowned in tears, sits in a theatre to see a play of hopes and fears, while the orchestra breathes fitfully the music of the spheres. Mimes in form of God on high mutter and mumble low, and hither and thither fly. Mere puppets they, who come and go at bidding of vast formless things that shift the scenery to and fro, flapping from out their condor wings, invisible woe. That motley drama, oh, be sure it shall not be forgot, its phantom chased forevermore by a crowd that sees it not, through a circle that ever returneth in unto the selfsame spot, and much of madness and more of sin and horror the soul of the plot. But see, amid the mimic rout, a crawling shape intrude, a blood-red thing that writhes from out the scenic solitude. It writhes, with mortal pangs the mimes become its food, and seraphs sob at vermin fangs in human gore imbued. Out! Out are the lights! Out all! And over each quivering form, the curtain, a funeral pall, comes down with the rush of a storm. And the angels, all pallid and wan, arising, unveiling, affirm that the play is the tragedy, man, and its hero, the conqueror worm.
Isn't it fascinating to see the echoes of his later work emerge here? The sense of inescapable cosmic dread. evermore, and what it echoes. Most of all, the sense of life unfolding on a canvas of blood, cruelty, and horror that defines and ends human lives passing by almost out of hand because of the scale on which true events move. You can see Lovecraft's ideas being shaped by Poe's here, almost in real time, and through that the authors that would be inspired by him, and much later push back against that inspiration. The two things that spring to mind are that moment which always haunts me, from the end of The Mist, as the lobstrosity thunders past nearby, seconds away from crushing the main characters, incapable of seeing them. The second is a novel published very recently, and written by escape artist's own Primi Mohammed. Beneath the Rising explores these ideas in a fascinating, honest, and very funny way. It's an extraordinary debut, and like so many novels, is somewhat eclipsed by world events right now, but I would encourage you to seek it out. It's absolutely worth your time. In fact, if you wanted a double bill that's as odd and fitting as it is brilliant, Beneath the Rising and Conquer a Worm is very much it. But there's an issue here larger even than the worms, larger even than that canvas. The fact the canvas continues. Hope. Continuity. Yes, the world is shaped by forces beyond our control. Yes, things are dark and dreary an extraordinary amount of the time. But we witness it. And in witnessing it, we not only give it boundaries, but we evolve both ourselves and the stories we witness. The horror shifting. The defenses against it shifting too. Thrust and parry. Attack and defend. An eternal arms race, yes, but evolution and change. Nothing stays still on this landscape, and not even the Conqueror worms can keep up all of the time. So, pick a good route, my friends. And thanks to all our guides this week. We'll keep this part brief. You're all busy people. We are on our final current Patreon goal. I actually know what the one after this is, and it's even more exciting, but we can't quite get there yet. We're aiming to pay our slush wranglers, or associate editors, to give them their other title. These are the people who interact with every story on our behalf, every author. They are the ones who pass stories up the line, who reject stories that don't quite work, who provide feedback where possible. They are the unsung heroes of the industry. That by itself is bad. They are often the unpaid heroes of the industry, and that is something we can do something about. Or rather, with your help, we can. If you like this story, and if you're able, and we know it's entirely possible to have the first be true, and not the second right now in particular, then please go to pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod. There you can donate or subscribe. Subscriptions start at as little as $5 a month and give you access to an extraordinary chunk of free audio content. Same is true over at Patreon, but there are also higher tiers you can subscribe at that get you merchandise, insider information, all manner of good stuff. All of it helps. All of it goes towards paying our authors, covering our server costs, helping pay our staff, pushing things forward, keeping us sustained and at the same time mobile, both of which are a challenge right now. If you can help with that, thank you from the bottom of my heart as co-owner and as someone who loves this industry. If you can't help financially, we understand completely. We know just how bad things are right now. And if that's the case, and you have the time, could I please ask you to perhaps donate a little of that? Nothing much. Just leave a review at Apple Podcasts or Google Play or wherever you found us. Perhaps tweet a link to an episode that you liked. Perhaps donate a review or an interview or something like that. We are chatty people, you might be able to tell. So if there's a project that you'd like us to tag in on, an interview about a story, anything like that, get in touch. We love doing this kind of stuff. Anyway, thank you to all of those of you who help in any way that you can. Those of you who want to, please do, and thank you. And most of all, just thanks to all of you for listening. It's really, really appreciated. We will leave you now, and we will leave you as we have arrived, and as we will be when we return next week. A production of Escape Artists Incorporated, released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Massive thanks to my intrepid audio producer, Marty. Massive thanks too to all our authors and narrators and the two-fisted, well, multiple-fisted, there are many of them and they all punch evildoers. PseudoPod editorial team, Sean, Alex and Karen. We leave you with this quote, which is from H.P. Lovecraft. I know, it seems like a lazy pull, but I swear I'm doing something here. It's actually from the opening credits of The Endless. Made 3 years ago, The Endless is the story of two brothers returning to the UFO death cult they escaped as kids, only to find not only have they been welcomed with open arms, but they seem to be the only two who have aged. It is a supremely strange, very funny, frankly terrifying movie, and it's, I believe, still on Netflix. Seek it out, it is absolutely worth it, and this quote from Lovecraft is in the opening credits. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. Next week, we have Hop Frog by Edgar Allan Poe, read by John Bell, hosted by myself, and audio produced by Marty. Until then, stay safe, have fun, and we'll be back in 7 days.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.